Testing, testing. You should hear that in a second.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to a celebration of the publication of Rachel Kushner's new novel, Creation Lake, by Simon & Schuster. And Rachel will be discussing the novel with Hua Hsu, a staff writer at The New Yorker and the author of Stay True, which we also have for sale in the back, along with Creation Lake and all of Rachel's other books. Welcome to those of you in person and those of you who are streaming online. All of our events are streamed and they are archived at PCG Studio and our YouTube page, which is 192 Books. Rachel Kushner is the author of The Hard Crowd, The Mars Room, The Flamethrowers, and her first novel, Telex from Cuba, as well as a book of short stories, The Strange Case of Rachel K. She has won the Prix Médicis and has been a finalist for the Booker Prize, the National Book Critic Circles Award, the Folio Prize, and was twice a finalist for the National Book Award in Fiction. Her books are translated into over 27 languages. I read this book, Creation Lake, like I read all of Rachel's books, in a weekend sprint. Having covered Banana Republics, the Movement of 77, and the Prison Industrial Complex, Kushner here turns her attention to eco-terrorism. Creation Lake concerns a secret agent, Sadie Smith, who is hired by a secret organization to infiltrate an eco-terrorist movement in the countryside of France. An organization under the influence of a cave-dwelling anthropologist, Bruno Lacombe. Building on the books of Manchette or Simenon, two writers we had the pleasure of discussing a few weeks ago, Kushner twists and subverts a classic noir, so swapping out the hard-nosed noble detective for a wry and complex heroine who is maybe not so noble. Steeped in history of our origins of May 68 and of the proliferation of global surveillance, Creation Lake is a masterpiece. I'll hand it over to Rachel. Thank you.
That was so nice. Thank you, Terrence. Wait, I hear feedback. Was I too close? Are they rolling like John Chamberlain sculptures upstairs? Can you guys hear all right? In the back too? Okay. Thanks everyone for being here. Actually, I was telling Hua, who I'm a huge fan of. I love his book, Stay True, so much. I have read it twice, and I plan to read it a third time. I was telling Hua, the first time I ever read in public, I believe, was at the second floor Paula Cooper Gallery across the way, because Paula was so kind to let us use her space to host an event for our zine. I don't remember what year it was, like 2006, maybe 2005. It was a long time ago. I didn't have, I'd never published anything. I didn't have children. I was just, her longtime employee, gallery associate, Anthony Allen, was our art editor. And Paula was just so open. And then when I published my first book, she invited me to read at 192 Books, and it was the first reading of my first book, and with her, and she was there in the audience. So it is just very special to come back here. I'm just going to read from a couple different passages in the book. I guess I could just say that for those who haven't read it, it only came out on Tuesday, so I don't expect that you will have read it. The narrator of this book is not forthcoming with the people she interacts with inside the narrative, nor with the reader about who she actually is, except that she does reveal that she's on assignment and is somebody who had originally worked for a federal agency in the US, like the FBI, and had entrapped a person that she was surveilling in order to secure his arrest, and that his conviction was later overturned and she was fired. And she kind of retreats into the very unregulated world of privately contracted surveillance, which is a real thing that love to talk to Hua and you about. She is in France on her way to a remote village in southwest central France, in this section that I'm going to read. And that she's on her way to the village where there's a group of young people that have built a commune. They're kind of from Paris and have decamped there, and the commune is called Le Moulin, the mill. And she's, planning to infiltrate the group. I am a better driver after a few drinks, more focused. Instead of trying to read my phone and put on lipstick, after several glasses of these regional wines, I faced forward. Oh, she keeps stopping at autoroute stops to drink the local wines that they have on display next to the register where you pay for your diesel. Drink lulled me into doing only what I was supposed to, drive the car. Except that I decided toll roads were going to put me to sleep, so I opted for a scenic route on secondary roads. I got lost winding through the Massif Central and its gear-grinding turns. Sure, I was reckless with the clutch, but it's hard for me to feel that rental cars have value. This one, a small hatchback Skoda, cost €8 a day. The Skoda was clean diesel, an oxymoron that was a metaphor for something, but I didn't know what. Clean diesel, clean coal, add the word clean and boom, it's clean. My navigation was off, and the scenic route took me way too scenically over a summit. I passed a tower on a cliff, its top edges eaten away like a sugar cone. At that point, when the ice cream is gone and the child is contractually obliged to take bites of its tasteless container. God damn it, I said. These breathtaking views were unappealing because they confirmed I was lost. I wanted only an indication by this point that I was headed northwest toward the city of Bollier. I saw no signs for Bollier. I was in remote forested highlands. I pulled off at the top of a summit into an unpaved lot adjacent to a building, some kind of mountain inn, hoping for directions. The inn was closed. Its windows were boarded. There was graffiti along its exterior walls, names and symbols fuzzed out in spray paint. It had just rained up here. The air was damp and warm and close, like human breath. The lot was crisscrossed with patterned ruts from truck tires. A mist hung in the branches of the low trees beyond the lot, as if a cloud had descended on this mountain and left its ragged parts among the woods. It felt like a place of aftermath where something had happened. I peed in the wooded area beyond the open lot. While squatting, I encountered a pair of women's day-glow orange underpants snagged in the bushes at eye level. This didn't seem odd. Truck ruts and panties snagged on a bush, that is Europe. The real Europe is not a posh cafe on the Rue de Rivoli with gilded frescoes and little pots of famous hot chocolate. This is a conception of Europe cherished by certain Parisians and as imaginary as the pastoral scenes in the frescoes on the walls of the posh cafe. The real Europe is a borderless network of supply and transport. It is shrink-wrapped pallets of super-pasteurized milk or powdered Nesquik or semiconductors. The real Europe is highways and nuclear power plants. It is windowless distribution warehouses where unseen men, Polish, Moldovan, Macedonian, back up their empty trucks and load goods that they will move through a giant grid called Europe, a Texas-sized parcel of which is called France. These men will ignore weight regulations on their loads and safety inspections on their brakes. They will text someone at home in their ethno-national language, listen to pop music in English, and get their needs met locally in empty lots on mountain passes. The only mystery is where they find the women for these occasions, but even that isn't so hard to imagine. A girl or woman fallen on hard times, not French, and without EU documents, stuck in a rural outpost, picking her way out to the main road in impractical high-heeled shoes of flesh-biting imitation leather, aloe in her purse for rapid-fire hand jobs. She had left her underwear in these woods. Big deal. Her world is full of disposability. The panties hanging on a bush in front of my face are a package of 3 for €5 at Carrefour. They are like Kleenex. You sweat or leak or bleed into them and then toss them on a bush or in someone's trash, or you flush them and clog the plumbing. Someone else's plumbing, hopefully. I had been drinking, as I said, and I had to go. I was making beer, as an unshaven Moldovan trucker might put it. A foaming reservoir filled its makeshift banks on the ground over which I squatted, and then it overflowed those banks, streaming like advanced troops sent downhill. I was still peeing and watching my pee make its way down the hill when I heard footsteps. I startled. Was someone here? And then I will read. So there's another character in the book. He's the other essential character in the book. It's all told in the first person from this woman, Sadie, who is unforthcoming about whatever her real name is. And she has intercepted the communications of a sort of elder to La Moulin. His name is Bruno Lacombe. And he's in his 80s and lived through World War II, barely survived it, lost his entire family, ended up on the streets of Paris, was a drinking companion to Guy Debord, went through May 68 and several splits of political alignment thereafter, ended up decamping to the countryside to explore the possibility of the peasant as a revolutionary subject, decided at some critical point that no revolution was coming and capitalism was here to stay, and that the only option for him was to retreat from this world while remaining in it and developing a manner of transforming consciousness, since the world itself was not going to change. And he ends up living in a cave on his own property. This is a region that is subtended by a vast underground linked world of caves. He'd been in the caves 12 years now, he said, and still he had not gotten to any definable end. The cavern's design instead calling into question the whole concept of an end. I hear people, he said, whose voices are eternal in this underground world, which is all planes of time on a single plane. Here on Earth, he said, is another Earth, a different reality, no less real. It has different rules. You won't understand any of this. Oh, I forgot to say that he's writing to the group, and she has cracked into he's living in a cave, but he's sending long email communications to the group. And she has cracked into his email. So it's her reading these. You might even dismiss what I say. The little I myself understand has taken patience and rigorous deprogramming. For 9/10 of human time on Earth, people went underground. Their symbolic world was formed in part by their activities in caves, by modalities and visions that darkness promised. Then this all ceased. The underground world was lost to us. The industrial uses of the earth, the digging, fracking, tunneling, are mere plunder and do not count, Bruno said. Modern people who build bomb shelters planning to survive some version of apocalypse also do not count, he said. Yes, they go underground, but not in mind of a human continuum, a community. They think, I'll be the clever one, the one who survives mass death. But why would you want to survive mass death? What would be the purpose of life if life were reduced to a handful of armed pessimists hoarding canned foods and fearing each other? In a bunker, you cannot hear the human community in the earth, the deep cistern of voices, the lake of our creation. In my cave, he said, under my cave, welling up from deeper passages, I hear so many things, not just the drip of water. I hear voices, people talking. Sometimes it's in French, sometimes Occitan or older languages of the Languedoc, many languages I do not recognize, some of which I cannot understand a word, but I know what I hear is humans. It is human talk. Did we always have language? We don't know the answer to this. Linguists try to chart what they call glottochronologies. They picture language like a tree with a trunk. The first language at the base of the trunk being simple and common, what some call nostratic. This is a fantasy, but who can refute them? They cannot escape the chains of their telos, the sad idea that they are the logical outcome, the advanced form of human speech. They never imagine that if language is a tree, they must look not at its trunk, but at its roots, which, like a tree's roots, might form an upside-down chandelier of extravagant complexity, reaching and spreading deep into the dark beyond. But most people are unable to grasp how far down the physical world goes, and they would not know that voices are stored in its depths. It's hard to explain, he said. You would have to have lived as I live, done what I've done, learned what I've learned, in order to hear what I hear. When you live underground, among the things you discover is that you are not alone. You're in a world richly peopled, occupied by legions. Homo erectus, who stood up and cooked, he is here. Homo neanderthalensis, who huddled modestly and dreamed expansively, also here. Homo sapiens, gone into caves to paint, to render his capture with extra legs, extra horns, so that these beasts canted and ran over cave walls or butted heads, clashed and fought, all in the light of a torch. H. Sapiens' underground cinema house. That resourceful and ruinous forebear of ours, he is here. Cathars and other heretics, the few not slaughtered, gone deep, living in darkness, yes, present. Cavers, 19th century men and boys killed by curiosity, fallen in, unable to make their way out, here. The partisans, men of my own boyhood, who retreated underground to hide from rampaging Germans, they too are here. For a long time, he said, you can't tune in. Then you might sense a current or buzz of telluric energy. This sound transforms the more time you spend in caves. It becomes voices. You hear these voices but are unable to isolate them. It takes years to learn how to listen, to differentiate, to adjust your inner tuner to a position on the atemporal bandwidth of the underground world. Remember shortwave transmission? He asked them. Probably you don't, he answered. Tuning into shortwave programming used to be an art, Bruno said. Depending on the bandwidth, it worked best at night on account of how radio waves travel back from the ionosphere. There was a book, he said, that listed program by calendar schedule and megahertz. Some of the programs came in stronger than others. You learned to listen for where to put the shortwave dial between 2 points of static and how to position your antenna to hear a Bulgarian choir or news from Senegal or Venezuela's Radio Juventud. Shortwave is real, of course, he said. It is also a metaphor. I bring it up not to reminisce over dead technologies, but to help you understand. Cave frequencies, he said, are not 3 to 30 megahertz. Cave bandwidth crosses moments, eras, epochs, eons. You have to learn to get inside the monophony, to tease it apart. Eventually, you encounter a polyphony. You begin to sort, to filter. You hear whispers, laughter, murmurs, pleas. There's a feeling that everyone is here. A wonderful feeling, I should add, because suddenly you realize how alone we have been, how isolated, to be trapped, stuck in calendar time, and cut off from everyone who came before us. I never want to be that alone again, he said. All right. Thanks.
Thanks for thanks for that. It's crazy because those are actually the two parts that I would have wanted you to read had I
Oh, great.
had a choice. Or two of my favorite parts of the book. Everyone can hear me, okay? Great. Thanks for being here with us. I'm going to kind of bombard Rachel with some incredibly basic questions for the next 20 or 30 minutes, and then there'll be time for audience questions in maybe half an hour, so hold on to those. It's always tricky to do this because, as you said, the book just came out, so we don't really want to spoil anything. But I was wondering if you could talk a bit about your interest in this particular region and in these particular political formations, because, you know, as many reviewers have pointed out, there's a lot of similarities to, say, the Invisible Committee and these sort of French leftist groups that I think for most people remain very anonymous and very kind of depersonalized. So I was wondering kind of where the beginnings of Creation Lake came from for you, and also kind of your interest in this specific region.
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you, Hua. Yeah, so, well, I have been going to France to a rural southwestern part for many years now. I guess, I don't know when we started going there, at least 12 years ago or something. And
But were you going for fun, or? I mean, did you just happen to be in this region and you discovered this, or does that make sense?
Yeah, yes. Yeah, I had a French friend who lives in the southern Corrèze. And this is not the main thing, but you mentioned the Invisible Committee, and Tarnac is located in the northern Corrèze, about an hour from this village where our friends live. But I think it's no secret that my husband has translated a book by the Invisible Committee called Introduction to Civil War, and we were both very familiar with the book that they published called The Coming Insurrection, which sort of became an American phenomenon thanks to Glenn Beck, who held it up on television and declared that the ultra-left was calling for violent insurrection. And that was after the people in the commune of Tarnac were raided, and as part of the evidence against them, the French police took, from what I understand, 3,000 books out of their library, and that case sort of dragged its way through the courts and was largely overturned, and nothing came of it. But I had personal knowledge and some relationship to those people and what happened in terms of their collision course, if you will, with the French state. But the book is not really based on them per se. And they are just one of many kind of fascinating iterations of people decamping to rural areas, or people who are, or from rural areas, who are farmers in these areas, taking a stand against the state and against the police. There's also Notre-Dame-des-Landes in the north, which are called it's called the ZAD. It's like the Zone of Defense, or the Zadis. And there's a book that Verso published with an introduction by Kristen Ross that has like really fascinating oral histories of that group, which has no real leader, whereas Tarnac had a kind of charismatic figure at the center. And with the ZAD in Notre-Dame-des-Landes, it was clergy, it was peasants, it was farmers, it was people who had decamped from cities, kids who were anarchists, who saw a threat to the environment and, sort of became part of it, and like Standing Rock kind of built, provisional but also permanent ideas about how to make community and make a world, and largely won against the police. And then prior to that, there's in the 1970s, what happened in Larzac, which is in the Lozère, which was like a very large occupation of I guess occupation is an embattled word, a large stand against the French state over a piece of land that Mitterrand wanted to expand into an army base, and he had to back off and give up, and the people won. And so there have been these like victories over the last 50 years in France, but prior to that, then you have peasant revolts. But, well, I'm skipping over. You have the resistance, and the Germans rampaged through this area during World War II, and there are caves, and there's resistance graffiti in those caves, and we spend part of every summer in an area that happens to be part of the fictional region that I call the Guyenne in the book. And the Guyenne is a real name for a no longer existent large swath of lower southern, western, central France that lasted from about 1200 until the French Revolution. And it includes areas that I know very well, including the Périgord Noir and the Lozère and some other places. And when you go to these places, you do have a sense that there's an underground world, and there's caves, and there are the well-known caves like Lascaux that no one gets to go in, that have a simulacrum, and painted caves that you can go into. But maybe more interestingly to me, there are caves on like every farmer's property that just have like a little grate and a door that you go in, and I would not have known about them were it not for the fact that my son went every summer to a camp that was run by a kind of local amateur hydrologist who would take them in the caves, and then he ended up being a counselor there and bringing children into caves, and so he would tell me about what they saw. And so it was a combination of all these things and then some, but I don't want to go on too long.
Well, one thing I really love about your work in general is that there's always a sort of ethical core to it, but there's never a sense that the book itself is very polemical. And in this case, you know, you've talked about these movements, these victories, and yet one of the protagonists of the novel is this character who you've just read, Sadie Smith. And I'm glad you read that, because it sort of reminded me about how the book is very serious, but it's also very funny, because she's just driving around. She's super into like regional wine and just getting drunk as she's driving around, trying to like undermine and subvert this group. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about your sort of relationship or projection onto this character, because is it still out? Okay, because she never seems.
What?
She's not a cynical character, right? So yeah, I was wondering if you could sort of talk about kind of your projection and relationship to Sadie.
Yes. So I for a long time, for like 3 years, or actually much longer, I had always wanted to write a book that was set among a group of young people who decamp from Paris to live communally and are on a kind of collision course with the French state. And they have this mentor who has rejected civilization and is living underground. But I had not figured out who would tell the story. And I wanted it to be somebody who had access to my sense of humor, and also like my own particular range, not my outlook, but maybe somebody who would be American, which is something quite different. Like I'm interested in outside views of things to some degree. I'm not comparing myself with him, but it's like when Robert Frank goes to the South, he sees different things than the Southern person would see, you know? So I wanted an American narrator, and I couldn't figure out who that would be. And something that I've thought about more only since finishing the book in terms of what the struggle was with that was that I knew enough about this type of communal environment and the social mores and the look of things that it felt like a kind of profound betrayal to utilize those and put them in a book, until I started to think about the people I'd heard of in real life who had actually betrayed these worlds. And there've been a few, but maybe most notably, there was an undercover agent from the UK, from the Metropolitan Police, who was surveilling different leftist groups in Germany, and England, and France. And he became rather sloppy and slept with several different women in these groups. And I think it was out of jealousy rather than suspicion that he was a cop that his glove box was rifled through at a certain point, and about 9 different passports with his name on it were found. And as the story was told to me, he was confronted by the group and he started to cry and said, I'm with you guys, it's like this has just been so confusing and I took that job, but I've completely changed sides and I don't know how to go back. And I've already been giving them false information to try to fuck them over and like, let's smash the state, and then a week later, he was gone and they never heard from him again. And I think of that as the Bart Simpson.
You mean he disappeared from the group? Or
he
was just
disappeared from the group,
Earth?
but kind of like no public life at all any longer. And I think of that Bart Simpson meme where he just disappears into the hedge. And it turned out that he was fired by the Metropolitan UK Police over the mess that he had made for them because they faced many lawsuits from the women that he'd had affairs with. And he was promptly hired by the company that used to be called Blackwater and was then being employed by them to look into what kind of sabotage might be brewing against interests of their own. He subsequently himself sued the Metropolitan UK Police for failing to protect him from falling in love. And watching that go down, I hadn't yet decided upon Sadie when I started to write Bruno's first communique. And the first communique that I wrote for him, the first 2 sentences of it became the first 2 sentences of the book. And I knew that it was something that was being intercepted. It was being conveyed by someone else. And the 2 lines were, Neanderthals were prone to depression, he said. They were prone to addiction too, and especially smoking. And, Neanderthals didn't smoke. Tobacco was not an old world plant like Bruno tries to argue. And I knew right away that the person conveying this would have the power to take pauses and editorialize and maybe comment back to Bruno. It wasn't obvious to me in those first 2 sentences that she would be a hostile force, but it became quickly apparent to me that she was like that UK agent, somebody who had been sent in, and that greenlit the entire project for me to say, this is how I know all this information about these people, which I, Rachel Kushner, happen to know, is that I'm occupying the role of a kind of devil. And she knows because she's infiltrated the group. And I had real world precedents to build the structure of her attachment and her disengagement and the idea that she would have these kind of shadowy bosses who she's never met, and also like her only backstory being prior dissimulations when she inserted herself in a group in order to destroy the lives of other people, like she's intending to do right now. And then the fun formal challenge of the book became, in what ways does she start to become susceptible to the messages that she's reading?
Yeah, so she's reading these messages, and again with Bruno, I felt like it's actually very funny when you think about how he's just sending these emails from his cave and asking these rhetorical questions that he goes on to answer. What were the sort of inspirations behind Bruno? Like, what were you reading in order to sort of flesh this character out?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So once I figured out how to do the book, like when I wrote those first 2 lines, I wrote the entire book in 14 months. And so I wasn't reading much. But over the years, I had been accumulating in a more organic way little tidbits of thoughts of things I was interested in and reactions.
Can I pause
things.
really quick?
Yes.
Can you give me some context? Like 14 months, that seems very fast.
Yeah, it was.
Like how long does it typically take you to write a novel, if there's a typical?
It takes me 5 years, but within that 5 years is like I pause, I write something else, I go back to it, I fail. With this book, for 3 years I was writing, I didn't keep any of that, like pages. But then the whole thing was very long days of writing. And I I had this, so I had an image of Bruno as a man who's putting his ear to the cave wall and hearing something like shortwave radio. I mean, that just comes from my own. I used to be into shortwave radio when I was young, and this is
Can
from.
you explain what shortwave radio is to anyone who?
Oh man, I don't really know if I can.
You can start with what radio is.
Yeah. So shortwave radio has been obviated by the internet, but used to be a way for countries to broadcast long range by bouncing their broadcasts actually off of our atmosphere, so that like if you're broadcasting, someone else can correct me later, forgive me, this may be wrong, but with shortwave, if you're broadcasting from the Western Hemisphere, it's much easier to broadcast east. And that's very convenient for the Cold War that seized the imaginations internationally for 50 years. So like the Americans would broadcast to Russia, the Russians would broadcast to Americans. And so there was a political motivation behind a lot of shortwave. And there's actually a shortwave station in the Central Valley that's like still there, and it's so bizarre. But in any case, I was interested in shortwave, but I had this image of Bruno with his ear to the wall, hearing these transmissions. And I don't know, I was thinking about voices. I remember being in the car with my parents as a child in the middle of the night, and there was an AM station that came on, and they were convinced that it was an AM radio wave that had been just like a free radical. I guess they can travel for a very long way in the atmosphere at night, and they thought they were picking something up that had been like it had a lapse of many years. I was thinking of Bruno listening to voices, and he's playing freely in the territory of history before the written down, which lends itself pretty easily to speculation. And, cultural anthropologists have built over the years ideas and maps and patterns of how people migrated. And, we look at what Bruno refers to as their trash, meaning the tools and bits of bone and whatever other detritus they leave behind. And then when the human genome was mapped and the Neanderthal genome was mapped, that upended all of that. And we realized we knew very little. And I think that Bruno kind of seizes that gap as an opportunity to speculate. And I saw him as somebody who, and maybe this is just kind of private joke between me and myself, who, normally when we think about the origins of accumulation and capital, the wrong turn taken by humanity is generally considered to be the dawn of the agricultural revolution, like 12,000 years ago. Bruno, on the other hand, is moving it way back, and he decides that perhaps it's 35,000 years ago, and he forms a kind of romantic attachment to the Neanderthal. It could have been the Denisovan. It could have been a different ghost population that we haven't yet given a name to, but the idea is that there's some beautiful loser that, later was rampaged over by the Homo sapien, who then comes to dominate. The Homo sapien likes to live in, likes large crowds, likes to live in big communities, uses a long-range throwing javelin, which Bruno considers cowardly because the Neanderthal used a short-range thrusting spear and had to live in intimacy with gore in order to have the fruits of his labor and eat the meat. So he's making things up to some degree. He's also influenced by or borrows a few biographical details from Jean-Michel Moncion, who was an associate of Guy Debord and in the Lettrist International, which was the first group that Guy Debord founded in Paris in the 50s, and then in the Situationist International in the 60s. And there was a book that he wrote called The Tribe, which City Lights published, and I read it in 2010. I just found my notes from that book the other day. I did not look at them when I was writing this book. It's a very simple, short book. It's called a memoir, but I think it was just him speaking to two interviewers and kind of shaped into a book. And what he says is so mysterious to me. It's a testimony about how drinking in the streets of Paris was a kind of revolutionary activity because you could sort of tumble through time and consciousness in a different way by altering yourself with drink. And Guy Debord admired that very much. Mancion was one of these kids who was like an orphan on the streets of Paris after the war. Debord was engaged to be married. He owned a car. His fiancée had a job, Michelle Bernstein. They lived in a nice apartment. And Debord would disappear for like 3 days at a time, and they figured he was off reading books, which he probably was. And there was this like exchange of expertise, of book knowledge and erudition, and and thieving, and also having let go, having no attachments, being free to destroy, not care. And some of the earliest of Bruno's biographical story is borrowed from Mancion, and I thought, well, maybe somebody will recognize that, probably nobody will, but Greil Marcus wrote me right away and said, I love that you took, one of Debord's inner circle and made him the kind of like the secret consciousness of 20th century France or something like that. But there's also this guy, Boris Porshnev, who was a Soviet cryptozoologist who was convinced that there were still existent strains of Neanderthal people hiding in the forested high plateaus of the Pyrenees Mountains, but he couldn't get the Soviets to let him go to France to do his field study research. And so he researched instead in outer Mongolia and wrote a book called The Soviet Sasquatch. In which, in the beginning, he says, if you don't have time to read this rather large compendium of stunning facts and shocking coincidences that you can only use to, arrive at the same conclusions as have I would suggest, if you're in a hurry, just reading chapters 1, chapter 6, chapter 7, and chapter 14. I read the whole book. No, I didn't. I read some of it.
That actually leads me to a question that I often have for writers, which is what are your routines when it comes to reading and also writing?
So my routines, well, some of it is like, it's a long organic collecting. It's like an accretion that happens through life to some degree, especially this book because of my relationship to France and to my family, who also have their own relationships to France and like our interests. Like I remember going to see an exhibition of the archive of Guy Debord and the Situationists at the Bibliothèque Nationale Française in, I don't know what year that was. It might have been 2011, a long time ago. And it's like I go to this exhibition and I heard that Debord's, what was left of his inner circle, Guy Debord, kind of famously shot himself to death in, somebody know, 95? Jason's here, he would know, a long time ago. And some of his inner circle that was left were like boycotting the exhibition because it's the most ironic thing of all time that the French state would buy the archive of Guy Debord and consider him a kind of national treasure when all he wanted was to set fire and burn every institution of the state. And there are little things like that that sort of propel me and grab my interest. So they aren't exactly research per se, but I did read like some prehistory. And as I would be reading, I would be saying things to myself like, why do they call it Stone Age? I'm quite sure that these people weren't like rock focused, rock centric, like hella super duper into rocks. And rather that, the Holocaust of time has burned away and destroyed and washed into disappearance all of the more, artists talk about fragile materials. I always think of Rauschenberg, fragile materials like wax, feathers, one Sperry topsider. Early people also used fragile materials, and that's all gone. And all we have is rocks, and so we just call them the Stone Age. And so as I was writing the book, there were just these fun opportunities for me to riff on that. And so Bruno says, like of a typhoon, if all that's left of a washed away village, even if it's 2007, if all that's left is twisted rebar and concrete, do we call those people the rebar age?
No, it spoils nothing to say that the Daft Punk song Get Lucky is on a surprising number of pages of this book. First of all, do you like the song?
Everyone likes that song, right?
All right, just making sure. Now, that's one of the only markers I feel that sort of like properly moors the book in whatever that year was, 2013.
Yeah.
In some ways, like the Neanderthal age or the 1960s feels almost more concrete than the quote unquote present of the novel. I was wondering if you could sort of talk through that strategy or sort of whether that was the intention.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a great question. I mean, just a great observation. I think that this Bruno speculations feel more concrete somehow. I mean, he's in the same geographical terrain as she is, and the novel needed to be set in time, and all of time is historical to some degree. It didn't have to be 2013. I wanted it to be maybe not too far from the time in which I watched young people in France be raided by the French police. But then it started to seem more future facing and even closer to now as I wrote, because I had chosen, not at random, but not with great deliberation, I had chosen this issue of the mega basins, which the young people are rejecting a program by private interests in the French state to basically suck all of the groundwater out of the water table and put it in these plastic-lined enormous bays that will then be utilized mostly by corporate farming interests. And I just needed them to have a thing that they're against. And it's easy to have farmers struggle in a fiction, because in real life, it's very hard to make a living as a farmer in France. And it's a place that has this deep history. It's the agricultural center of Europe. In 1950, I think it's like 1/3 of people who lived in France were farmers. Now it's 2%. There's been a lot of out-migration in these villages. So some of the conditions and features of rural France in 2013 would be the same as now. And after I wrote the book, the mega basin issue had exploded, and there was a new movement called Les Soulèvements de la Terre. And that almost seemed like it was part of the book, except it was outside of the book. And I think, that I just got lucky in terms of like choosing something that seemed to be running toward a world and arriving into, I sometimes think reality is just
all around the world. Yeah,
reality is just like the final completion of the work of art. It just holds the book in place. But then there were those two. I had been in Marseille in the summer of 2013, and going from the train station to the cab, to the hotel, to the bar, to the pharmacy, to the beach, to passing a motorcycle with a sound system, everybody was listening to Get Lucky. It was just the song of the summer, and it was forming kind of one scroll. And I sent Sadie, my narrator, to Marseille with her boyfriend, who isn't really her boyfriend. She sidled up to him in order to get connected with the group because he's childhood friends with their leader. And they go to Marseille because he's filming a movie. And I'm furnishing the parallel universe. I'm having fun with real things so that it takes on the kind of burnish of a reality factor. And then it was Get Lucky, and it might as well be the year that song played. And then it also can kind of anchor the reader a little bit. If they need or want an orientation in time, it's then.
Yeah, it has a very kind of wobbly, warped effect. I just have one more question, and then we'll open it up to the beautiful audience we have here. I was reading an interview you did with The Drift, and you kept using this term, think into. You'd say,
oh no, was I repeating myself?
No, I thought it was a really elegant kind of phrase. You said something like, in writing The Mars Room, I had to think into something almost impenetrable, as if I was at the bottom of the well. I was wondering, I mean, because I think we are always trying to kind of, as writers, wrap our heads around something through making it material through words. What do you mean by thinking into something? Like, I just thought that was such a fascinating way of putting it. And do you think that there's something that that all of your works of fiction, nonfiction are trying to kind of think into or comprehend?
I don't know. I think that maybe, you just gave me like a cheat with the clue that I was using that expression in relationship to my previous novel, The Mars Room, which was a very, very different experience to write than this book, because it was an occasion for me to think into this, sorry to put it in simpler, crude terms, to think into this axis, if you will, of innocence and guilt and what those things are. And at that time in my life, I was very involved in and working with friends and colleagues who are serving life sentences in prison. And I wanted to think about the difference between like softer social forms of violence and then having friends who like literally killed somebody with an axe, and feeling that that's absolutely foreclosed as a subject. And I will never understand why that happened, and nor do I need to, because I do have a kind of a desire to extend to people almost in a Christian way, a form of mercy. And I was reading the Brothers Karamazov, and there's a famous scene in that book where Alyosha tells the children to remember this moment all your lives. And it instructed me that innocence is a kind of like a bubble or kernel inside the person that has a shine to it and can never be taken away from them. That early innocence that Alyosha tells the children to remember. And I had to think into all those things. And it wasn't through reading or having fun that I would come to a path forward through the book. And that's why I use the metaphor of being at the bottom of a well. It was like I had to get to the other side. And sometimes it almost felt like a sort of cretinizing experience because it had no intellectual features to it. It was just thinking and listening and trying to form my own sense of morality and forgiveness and grace. And those are really big topics. And I wanted to find an organic and very personal path into them. With this book, it all rolled along quite easily. And because I had Bruno, who has a sort of facility with language and thought, or at least for me, he does. And he's a homespun philosopher. Like, he's making ideas the way some people are spinning pizza dough, and he's doing it with the ingredients that are available to him, which were ingredients that were available to me and being transmitted from me to him quite seamlessly, since he's my character. In terms of thinking into, I mean, with Sadie, she is as you said at the beginning, I think, an amoral figure, meaning she can judge all people equally, kind of like the sun applies itself equally, to everything on earth. And that frees her to point out other people's contradictions, but not necessarily from a place of judgment. Like, she points out that, there's a rather essentialized division of gendered labor in the commune, but she's not a feminist. She's not saying it from an interested purview. She looks at everybody else and sees their flaws and thinks that she sees things in them that they don't even themselves see. And she has this idea that she's rigging the whole apparatus of reality. And that gave the book a kind of formal structure, because there's no need for any coincidence when you have a narrator who's a manipulator. At the same time, it calls into question whether or not her confidence is durable and everlasting. And over the course of the book, as I said before, she starts to become vulnerable to Bruno and maybe even
don't spoil
his
it.
best student. Okay, all right.
No, I think it's good to end on that cliffhanger of what happens there.
Okay, thank you, Hua.
Again, congratulations on this amazing book, and hopefully everyone will have a chance to read it soon. The floor is open for questions from the audience.
And there's a microphone. I see a
Yeah.
hand in the back. We're up all night to the sun.
Thank you, Ms. Kushner. I've always enjoyed your books, and I was introduced to them by Robert Stone, so I'm really, yeah, I have to mention Robert Stone. When you were speaking at the Center for Fiction, you mentioned that you were fascinated with Puritan writings. Is that something you pursued because, Puritan conversion narratives, or, 'cause are you stuck with Manchette and Balestrini?
Well, that's a future project. So once I get off this tour, we'll see. But yeah, I'm interested in the sermon as a literary form, and maybe I have a suspicion that it's the form of American literature, that it derives from the sermon. But I need to go home and do some thinking and reading to figure that out. Thank you for mentioning Robert Stone. Such an incredible writer. I love his first novel, Hall of Mirrors, which I think people don't talk about enough. And I did have the good fortune of meeting him and corresponding with him, and he would always sign his letters a blessing. So to get back to the Puritan thing, other questions?
I think that if my memory is correct, which is always an issue, Sadie might have said, or in the book it says, that people who think they've figured out everybody else are essentially missing something. And I wonder if I remember that correctly, if that's a comment on Sadie, because Sadie goes through the book thinking she's figured out everybody and thinking she's putting something over on people, but
Yeah.
is she missing something herself, or is she just going down her road?
I could be wrong, but I think that maybe that was me saying that in an interview, that people who think they have everybody else figured out are missing something. Yeah. And well, toward the end of the book, I feel it becomes more clear whether or not Sadie is correct in her calculations about other people. I mean, maybe one thing I could say about her as a character in terms of, the conventions and pressures of fiction are such that depth, and maybe human, social life is like this too, that depth requires an understanding of something to do with that person's past. And usually in fiction, we'll get some early kind of primal scene. And I do provide that with Bruno. The primal scene is that he puts on the helmet of a dead Nazi soldier and promptly contracts lice from the helmet, because the lice are fleeing the head of a dead man in order to further themselves by taking up residence on the head of a living person, and they arrive on his head. But in terms of Sadie, I didn't want to have a traditional psychological backstory for her. I didn't need even to have an argument why. It was just pure instinct from the beginning that it wasn't relevant to the story, and that moreover, more relevant for her, because she's always shoring herself up, is for her to revisit previous guises in which she, was a dissimulator and set out to destroy the lives of other people, like she's intending to do now. And so she'll tell a story about another job that she did, and she'll fixate on the people, like the job that got her fired. She fixates on those people, which she entrapped, and because of her, one of them ended up serving 9 years in federal prison, but she sees herself as the victim and them as the perpetrators, because the job went wrong and she was fired when the conviction was overturned. In other places, it provided for me an opportunity for more like light humor. She ends up a little bit like that undercover agent for the Metropolitan UK that I was telling you about, who in real life slept with a lot of different women. She eventually decides to sleep with like the one hot guy in the commune. She has a thing about rural Frenchmen wearing their pants up very high, like right up by the sternum. She says, like, the more rural you go, the higher the pants get. The thinner the grocery store espadrilles become in their worn outness. His pants are only midway, and she ends up having an affair with him, and she describes the smell that issues from his armpits as being like hydroponic weed, which some guys' armpits do smell that way. And it could be like a nice, sweet, sort of grassy, innocent smell. Sadie enjoys it because sentimentally, it reminds her of the bust of a large grow facility in Idaho that she facilitated, you know? So there were like little opportunities to make memories for her. And in terms of her having the world all sewn up and figured out, those memories are being used by her as a kind of resource to tell her who she is and, you know, what makes her, what forms her.
We have time for maybe one more question, and then Rachel will sign books. Right?
Thank you.
Yeah, and Hua might sign a book, I think. They have your books here. Stay True is so great, you guys. That book makes me cry, too. Ugh.
Hi.
Wait, Paula's going to ask a question, and then we have to have two more last questions. Do you guys have time for that?
How you arrived at the loss of his child, Bruno's daughter, as the reason for his whole.
That's such a
being
great
that
question. Yeah. So Bruno had moved, you know, after May 68, and it's afterlives and fallouts and failures, had moved to the countryside with a wife, and they had 3 children, and they lived on this tract of land where he still is, but now down in his caves. And I knew that something had happened that would be a more personal thing that would propel him away from people and into maybe an idea of people and a way to capture some kind of utopian drift to make him feel okay about people in the past and the future. And what happens is that his 8-year-old daughter, he's teaching her to drive a tractor, and she turns the tractor on a hill and it tips over and kills her. You know, things like that do happen. I mean, maybe it's odd to admit this, but I had been watching my son learn how to drive a tractor, a 1958 Oliver that my cousin was teaching him to turn. And he said, don't turn it on a hill because these old tractors have no roll bar. They will kill you immediately if they turn over. So, you absorb things from life. I have family members who are farmers. I'm like familiar with the rural environment and the danger of tractors. And then it just built from there. And it made sense to me that his yearning wouldn't just be, it's not an intellectual yearning. I mean, as Sadie thinks there's no politics inside of people. I could say a lot or a little about that. And for me, maybe it means politics in the thinnest, most topical sense. And what's inside of people maybe is a little bit deeper and formed by these kind of primal scenes and traumas. So yeah, he had lost a daughter, and the narrator, Sadie, kind of decides later in the book that maybe Bruno thinks down there by putting his ear to the wall and hearing frequencies and currents of telluric energy that he is in a space populated by all planes of time at one plane, including the time on which his daughter resides, wherever she is. But doesn't go beyond that, you know? It's not the movie Ghost. Was there one final question in the back, if you still want to ask it?
Geez, I'm sorry. This is just a real easy question. When and if you have downtime, do you prefer picking up a nonfiction piece to read? Let's say you're on vacation, or do you choose to pick up a novel, a contemporary novel or a classic novel? Again, if you have downtime, what do you enjoy reading?
Yeah. Well, I am sitting with a writer who writes brilliant memoir, but I will also answer honestly, it's fiction forever for me, baby.
All right, thanks to Rachel. Let's keep it going. And thanks to Paula, thanks to the staff of the gallery and the bookstore as well. Thanks to all of you wonderful people for being here. If you can queue up in an orderly fashion, Rachel would be happy to sign your book. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Yeah, of course. I'm so grateful to you. You asked such good questions. Hi, how are you?
I just want to say hi. My name is Barbara Heiser, and we work at Grand Street. I was the first managing editor in Walker.
Oh my gosh, really? Wait, when were you the managing editor? Wow. I love Walter so much.
And I was also